There is a moment when envy stops being loud. It no longer competes, no longer compares openly, no longer argues or tries to prove anything. Instead, it goes quiet, and that silence is not peace, it is strategy. When envy turns silent, danger draws near, because silence is where observation sharpens and intentions mature. Loud envy wants to be seen. Silent envy wants to strike without being noticed. And most people fail to recognize this shift because they mistake quietness for acceptance, distance for healing, and calm faces for harmless hearts. But silence, when fueled by envy, is not empty, it is loaded. It is the pause before something unseen begins to move. Envy becomes most dangerous when it no longer seeks validation from others. At first, envy speaks through jokes, backhanded compliments, subtle comparisons, or dismissive remarks. But when those tactics fail, when the person it envies continues to rise, glow, or remain unbothered, envy retreats inward. That retreat is not surrender, it is recalibration. Silent envy studies patterns, weaknesses, timing, and access. It learns when to smile, when to stay quiet, when to blend in, and when to wait. This is why the most harmful intentions are rarely announced. They are rehearsed quietly while appearing supportive on the surface. What makes silent envy especially dangerous is that it hides behind familiarity. It often comes from people who once laughed with you, shared space with you, or benefited from your openness. These are not strangers throwing stones from afar. These are individuals who know your rhythm, your habits, your trust points. And when envy turns silent in such people, it means they have stopped expressing their discomfort and started internalizing resentment. Internalized envy does not fade with time. It ferments. It hardens into entitlement, bitterness, and a quiet belief that you deserve to lose what you have. Silence gives envy the advantage of invisibility. While you continue living authentically, focused on growth, healing, or purpose, silent envy watches without interruption. It gathers information without exposing emotion. It smiles without warmth. It listens without celebrating. And the danger lies not in what is said, but in what is no longer said. When encouragement disappears, when curiosity fades, when engagement drops but proximity remains, it signals a shift. Silence is no longer neutral. It becomes a mask worn to stay close while feeling far. The most unsettling truth is this. Silent envy does not want to outgrow you, it wants to outlast you. It waits for moments of vulnerability, fatigue, or transition. It hopes you will lower your guard, assume safety, and forget discernment. That is why awareness matters, not paranoia, but perception. When envy turns silent, it is no longer about competition, it is about control. And recognizing that shift early is not weakness. It is wisdom. Silent envy thrives on proximity without connection. It stays close enough to observe, but distant enough to avoid exposure. This is where many people misjudge the situation. They assume silence means maturity, growth, or emotional distance for peace. In reality, silent envy often chooses closeness because distance would remove its access. It wants to remain in the room, in the circle, in the conversation's shadow, watching how others respond to you, tracking how doors open for you, noting who supports you and who hesitates. Silence becomes its camouflage, allowing it to exist without raising alarms. One of the clearest signs that envy has turned silent is the disappearance of celebration. Achievements that once sparked congratulations now meet neutrality. Good news is acknowledged without enthusiasm or ignored entirely. There is no confrontation, no criticism, just absence. And absence, when intentional, is communication. Silent envy refuses to feed your joy because your joy reminds it of what it believes it lacks. Rather than confront those feelings, it chooses withdrawal, convincing itself that withholding energy is power. What it does not realize is that this withdrawal sharpens resentment instead of resolving it. Silent envy also alters behavior in subtle ways that are easy to dismiss. The person becomes observant but no longer participatory. They listen more than they speak, not to understand, but to gather context. They remember details not out of care, but out of calculation. Their silence is not emptiness, it is storage. Every success you mention, every opportunity you step into, every boundary you enforce becomes another entry in a quiet mental ledger. Over time, this accumulation turns admiration into fixation, and fixation into hostility disguised as indifference. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is that silent envy often convinces itself it is justified. It reframes your progress as favoritism, your confidence as arrogance, your boundaries as betrayal. Because nothing is said aloud, these narratives go unchallenged. Silence allows distorted stories to grow unchecked. And once envy feels morally justified, it no longer sees itself as harmful. It begins to believe that undermining, distancing, or quietly hoping for your downfall is balance being restored rather than harm being intended. At this stage, silent envy is no longer reactive. It is intentional. It has crossed from emotion into posture. It waits patiently, appearing calm while internally restless. And the danger is not that it will always act, but that when it does, it will feel no remorse. Silence has already rehearsed the outcome. That is why discernment matters more than explanation. You do not confront silent envy with words. You protect yourself with awareness, boundaries, and distance that does not announce itself. Silent envy reveals itself not through open conflict, but through shifts in energy that are felt more than seen. Conversations lose warmth. Interactions feel flatter, heavier, or strangely hollow. You may notice that your presence no longer invites openness, but instead creates tension that cannot be explained. This is because silent envy carries an internal resistance toward you that has not been processed or released. The person is physically present, but emotionally withdrawn, creating a subtle imbalance that your intuition registers long before your mind understands it. Another sign of silent envy is selective engagement. The person responds when it benefits their image, but withdraws when your growth is the focus. They may show interest in neutral topics, yet go quiet when your progress, clarity, or confidence surfaces. This inconsistency is not accidental. It is an unconscious attempt to regulate their discomfort. By disengaging from your wins, they protect their ego from comparison. Silence becomes a coping mechanism that slowly transforms into emotional distance masked as neutrality. Silent envy also distorts perception. The envying person begins to interpret your silence as arrogance, your boundaries as rejection, and your independence as a threat. Because they are no longer communicating openly, assumptions replace dialogue. And assumptions, when left unchecked, harden into beliefs. These beliefs then shape behavior. Coldness replaces warmth, observation replaces participation, and judgment replaces curiosity. From the outside, nothing dramatic appears to change. But internally, the relationship has shifted from connection to quiet opposition. Timing becomes another revealing factor. Silent envy often surfaces when you experience a breakthrough rather than a struggle. People are more comfortable supporting you when you are in pain than when you are thriving. Growth forces comparison, and comparison exposes unresolved insecurities. When envy turns silent, it is often because the person no longer knows how to relate to you from an equal emotional footing. Instead of adjusting, they retreat inward, allowing distance to grow while maintaining outward composure. Your intuition will often sense silent envy before evidence appears. You may feel compelled to explain yourself unnecessarily, to shrink your excitement, or to dim your light around certain people. That urge is not random. It is your awareness responding to subtle resistance. Silent envy creates an unspoken pressure to minimize yourself so others can remain comfortable. Recognizing this is critical. You are not responsible for managing someone else's discomfort with your growth. Awareness is not accusation, it is self-respect. When silent envy deepens, it often shifts from passive observation into subtle interference. This interference is rarely obvious or direct. It shows up as delayed support, missed opportunities to speak on your behalf, or a quiet refusal to advocate for you when it matters. Where encouragement once existed, neutrality now stands, and neutrality in critical moments can change outcomes. Silent envy does not always attack. Sometimes it simply steps aside and allows obstacles to remain in place, believing that withholding support is cleaner than causing visible harm. Another way silent envy escalates is through quiet influence. The envying person may not speak against you openly, but they also do not correct misinformation when it arises. Silence becomes complicity. By allowing doubts, misunderstandings, or negative impressions to circulate unchecked, silent envy creates distance between you and others without ever being traced back to its source. This is how reputations can be weakened not by lies, but by the absence of truth spoken at the right time. Silent envy also expresses itself through selective loyalty. The person remains present when your position is uncertain, but becomes emotionally absent when your stability or confidence increases. This selective closeness reveals a hidden agenda: comfort in your struggle, discomfort in your strength. Their silence during your rise is not accidental. It is resistance disguised as detachment. And the danger lies in assuming that silence equals harmlessness, when in reality, it often signals internal opposition. At this stage, silent envy may also attempt to test your boundaries indirectly. Small moments of disregard appear: missed communication, subtle dismissiveness, or a lack of consideration where it once existed. These are not random lapses, they are signals of shifting respect. Silent envy struggles with the idea that you no longer occupy a position it once felt comfortable with. Rather than adapt, it withdraws, hoping distance will restore internal balance without requiring personal growth. This is the moment where clarity becomes protection. Not every silence requires confrontation, and not every distance requires explanation. Silent envy often exposes itself through patterns, not events. When you notice consistency in withdrawal, lack of advocacy, or emotional absence during your growth, it is not your role to fix the discomfort. Your role is to adjust access. Boundaries are not punishment. They are self-preservation. Silent envy becomes most revealing during moments of your vulnerability, not because it suddenly speaks, but because it watches more closely. When you are tired, uncertain, or in transition, silent envy pays attention. It notices the pauses in your confidence, the cracks in your momentum, the moments where you are recalibrating. These moments are not exploited loudly, they are observed quietly. Silent envy does not rush, it waits. It understands that timing matters more than force, and that patience can accomplish what confrontation cannot. During vulnerable periods, you may notice a strange shift. Those who were distant during your strength may suddenly reappear. This return is not always supportive. Sometimes it is investigative. Silent envy seeks confirmation, proof that your rise was temporary, that your confidence had limits, that your stability could be shaken. It may offer surface-level concern without depth, questions without solutions, or presence without reassurance. This is not empathy. It is assessment disguised as care. Silent envy is uncomfortable with your resilience. When you recover quickly, regain clarity, or continue forward despite difficulty, it becomes unsettled. This is why it prefers your uncertainty to your healing. Struggle confirms its internal narrative. Strength contradicts it. Silence allows envy to preserve hope that you will eventually falter. And when that hope is challenged by your consistency, the internal tension increases, making silence heavier, colder, and more deliberate. Another danger during vulnerable seasons is oversharing. Silent envy benefits from information it did not earn. It listens carefully when you explain your plans, your fears, or your next steps. It stores this information quietly, not always to use against you directly, but to understand your trajectory. This is why discernment matters most when you are emotionally open. Not everyone who listens cares. Some listen to locate leverage. Your vulnerability does not require an audience. Silent envy thrives on access without accountability. Protecting your inner world is not secrecy, it is wisdom. When you learn to share selectively, you reduce exposure without hardening your heart. Silence, when chosen by you, becomes strength rather than risk. And in that strength, silent envy loses its advantage. When silent envy realizes it no longer has access to you, its internal tension intensifies. Distance removes observation, and without observation, envy loses control. This is why silence sometimes deepens when you establish boundaries. It is not always acceptance. It can be frustration. Silent envy struggles when it cannot monitor your movements, your growth, or your emotional state. The absence of information feels like loss of power, and that loss often reveals itself through colder behavior or complete emotional withdrawal. At this stage, silent envy may attempt subtle re-entry. This does not always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it appears as casual check-ins, vague curiosity, or sudden interest in your life after a long period of indifference. These moments are not always malicious, but they are rarely innocent. Silent envy seeks reassurance that it still has relevance. It wants confirmation that distance has not made it irrelevant or invisible. Silence shifts shape here, from passive to probing. Another response to loss of access is quiet resentment. When boundaries are enforced without explanation, silent envy interprets them as rejection rather than self-protection. This misinterpretation feeds internal narratives of injustice. Because nothing is spoken openly, these feelings remain unchallenged. Silence once again becomes a breeding ground, this time for entitlement and bitterness. The person convinces themselves that they are owed access, understanding, or proximity, even when none was promised. Silent envy may also attempt to regain balance by diminishing you internally. It minimizes your achievements, reframes your growth as luck, or convinces itself that your distance is temporary. These mental adjustments are defensive. They protect the ego from confronting the truth, that you have outgrown the dynamic, and rather than rising to meet you, silent envy retreats further into quiet opposition, hoping time will reverse what growth has made permanent. This is where emotional detachment becomes powerful. You do not need to be understood by those who benefit from misunderstanding you. Silence chosen by you is clarity. Silence chosen by envy is confusion. When you remain grounded, consistent, and unreactive, silent envy has nothing to work with. Distance becomes your ally, not your loss. When silent envy reaches its final stage, it becomes inconsistent. The calm, controlled quietness begins to crack under internal pressure. You may notice sudden mood shifts, brief moments of irritation, or subtle, passive behavior that feels out of character. This happens because silence can only contain resentment for so long. When envy realizes it cannot influence access or compare anymore, it loses its anchor. The result is emotional leakage, small, telling signs that something unresolved is surfacing. At this point, silent envy may alternate between distance and forced normalcy. One moment it acts indifferent, the next it tries to reinsert itself casually into your space. This inconsistency is not confusion, it is internal conflict. The person wants relevance without vulnerability, closeness without accountability. And because they never address the envy openly, they lack the emotional tools to reset the dynamic in a healthy way. Silence, once protective, becomes destabilizing. Another revealing sign is subtle competitiveness, returning after long quietness. It may show up as indirect comparison, sudden mentions of personal achievements, or an urge to assert value without invitation. This is not confidence, it is compensation. Silent envy resurfaces when the person feels overshadowed by your steadiness. Even without direct interaction, your presence becomes a mirror they cannot avoid. And mirrors, when ignored too long, eventually force recognition. Silent envy also becomes more sensitive at this stage. Neutral actions from you may be misinterpreted as dismissive or intentional. Boundaries feel personal. Silence feels like rejection. Growth feels like abandonment. Because nothing was ever addressed, the emotional gap widens without explanation. This sensitivity is not about you. It is about unresolved self-comparison finally surfacing when silence can no longer suppress it. This is the moment clarity settles in. You realize that not every connection is meant to be repaired, and not every silence deserves interpretation. Silent envy exposes itself when it can no longer maintain composure. And when you see it clearly, your role is not to engage, but to remain steady. Stability becomes the boundary that requires no words. When silent envy reaches its end, It does not always erupt. It often fades, not because it has healed, but because it has lost relevance. When you stop feeding comparison, stop offering access, and stop explaining your growth, silent envy runs out of purpose. It cannot compete with consistency. It cannot study what it cannot reach. And without proximity, it loses the quiet advantage it once relied on. Distance becomes final, not dramatic, just clear. This stage brings an unexpected peace. You no longer feel the need to analyze behavior, interpret silence, or question energy. Clarity replaces confusion. You understand that some people were only meant to walk with you until your growth challenged their comfort. Their silence was never about maturity. It was about resistance. And recognizing this allows you to release responsibility for their emotions without resentment or guilt. There is strength in choosing not to react. Silent envy feeds on attention, even negative attention. When you remain grounded, focused, and unbothered, you deny it fuel. Growth becomes your response. Peace becomes your statement. And in that stillness, you realize that protection does not always look like confrontation. It often looks like alignment with what no longer requires explanation. The final lesson silent envy teaches is discernment. You learn to read energy without fear, to observe patterns without accusation, and to trust your intuition without needing proof. This awareness does not harden you, it sharpens you. It teaches you to move with clarity, to guard your inner world, and to value relationships that celebrate rather than tolerate your becoming. When envy turns silent, danger may be near, but so is awakening. Awareness transforms risk into wisdom. You walk forward lighter, not because others changed, but because you did. And in that quiet strength, nothing hidden can follow you where clarity leads.